as it's
Hello,
right.
this is Aaron Wissner of Local Future, and this is live from Michigan and New Zealand. And we're here with Nicole Foss in New Zealand, Aaron Wissner in Michigan. We are going to talk about the news for the past couple of weeks. It is Monday, July the 27th, 2020. And this program, we have many of these on the internet on the Local Future YouTube channel. You can look under Local Future, or I've also been calling this like the deep shock, because we have this deep shock going on right now, which is impacting more and more people as time goes on. Now, Nicole, can you just give us a one-line introduction for anybody who doesn't know you?
So I'm a big picture person, and I look at what's going on in the world and try and make sense of it for people, sort of connect what's going on in finance and energy and geopolitics and all sorts of other things to sort of pull it together and create a map for people to be able to figure out where they go from here.
Excellent. And I'm Aaron Wissner. I'm a public school teacher, retired, and the founder and organizer of Local Future, which is a nonprofit educational organization to help people envision a positive future, no matter what the unpositive futures might appear to be. So, Nicole, I've not been paying attention to the news for the past 2 weeks on purpose, because I wanted to hear your perspective rather than reading someone else's stuff and being like, boy, that's what sort of bias is in there. I want to hear your more clear-headed perspective. What is going on in the world in the last 2 weeks, or even July in general? So what's going on?
Well, in the States at the moment, the really big thing that's happening is that the federal troops are being sent into American cities,
So
particularly.
National Guard troops, is that what you're talking about?
Well, there's a mishmash. There's a border patrol and DHS and things, but they're not labeled. So the problem is that they're not a labeled police force. They're not a recognized form of official authority. So imagine if you're in Portland and some of these people come along and they're dressed in camo and they all have these military weapons, and they decide to grab you off the street, which they have done, throw you in the back of an unmarked van and take you God knows where. They don't tell you you're being arrested. They don't tell you why you're being picked up. They just stuff you in the back of an unmarked van. This has an awful lot of echoes of, say, Pinochet's Chile. I think so far they don't seem to be harming people. So they're not disappearing people and sending them to torture camps like Pinochet did, not at the moment anyway. But the problem is that anyone can dress up in camo and drive an unmarked van. You need to have law enforcement being officially identified. You need to know who are law enforcement, and there needs to be accountability. This is why officers wear badges and insignias. You know who they're affiliated with, and if something happens that shouldn't happen, then you can take that up the chain of command, and you may be able to do something about it. But when you have a whole bunch of people who are absolutely unidentified, they're not necessarily official law enforcement at all. There's been some talk that some of them are Eric Prince's mercenaries. So Eric Prince is a billionaire, the brother of Betsy DeVos, the education secretary, who's also a billionaire.
A Michigan native.
Yep. So Eric Prince is trying to privatize war for his own profit worldwide. He runs a massive mercenary force. And it is possible that some of the people on the streets, in particular in Portland right now, Portland is really what's been going crazy for the last couple of weeks. And some of his people seem to be there, but there are cobbled together forces from multiple federal agencies. Now, they only have legal authority to protect federal property. This is not what they're doing. So they're cruising around, they're pulling people off streets into unmarked vans and things like that. The brutality that's been seen on the streets of Portland for the last couple of weeks has been insane. I mean, people are being deliberately targeted with headshots.
Now, why is it Portland? Is that where that little downtown free zone was? I thought that was Seattle. Or
that was Seattle.
Why the attention on Portland? I mean, where I don't remember that being in the news.
Oh, it is now. So Portland, I presume that Portland is just this hotbed of liberalism, of left-wing wokeness and things like that. So they go in there with these forces and they try to provoke these people who've been demonstrating for Black Lives Matter. And to some extent it works, although the protests have been remarkably peaceful from the point of view of the protesters. The protesters have not been attacking people, but the protesters have been continuously attacked and provoked themselves. So there are people there every night. And it started with general protests. Then there was a wall of mothers. The police or the federal forces attacked the wall of mothers. Then there was a wall of fathers and they brought leaf blowers. This is interesting. There's a war of the leaf blowers going on in Portland. So leaf blowers are used to blow the tear gas back to the feds. But then the feds have leaf blowers too. So now there's the war of the leaf blowers going on over a fence around a federal courthouse in Portland. And
doesn't this just sound crazy, Nicole? I mean, isn't this like what kind of craziness is just going on here? I mean, are they trying to protect? Is the idea they're trying to protect federal buildings, or they're just trying to protect rich people's stuff and corporation stuff?
Protecting federal buildings. In practice, they're doing far more than that. So what they're doing has no basis in law. This is not law enforcement. This is a military or quasi-military takeover of the center of an American town. So it started with the wall of moms, then the wall of dads with the leaf blowers. Then there was the wall of veterans. And now there's a wall of doctors. And each time it's like, who can we put out there that they won't attack? But they attack them anyway. People have been shot in the head. People have had brain injuries. People have been severely injured in Portland over the last couple of weeks. Quite a number of people. The brutality has been horrendous. And it's now starting in other places. So Seattle, it's starting in Seattle. Trump has mentioned Albuquerque and New York and Chicago. But often these forces are being sent in over the objections of the local authorities. The local authorities are saying, we can handle this ourselves. We do not want your agent provocateur in our town, but they're being sent anyway. This is another way to completely override the local authorities in democratic cities. This is an important point. It's the democratic cities that are being disrupted, because the idea is to say, see, democratic cities are always places of violence where everything goes wrong. So you have to get rid of all the Democrats because the Democrats are the problem. This is completely false. This is pure projection. I mean, yes, there's violence in some of these cities. Chicago isn't exactly a perfect place in every way, but nevertheless, the response—
Are they doing this in Chicago as well, Nicole? Having these
in Chicago? That's
that again.
List. They actually managed to get the mayor to agree to it in Chicago after a call with Trump. So I don't know in what way he threatened or blackmailed her, but she changed her mind and is going to allow them on the streets of Chicago. In Portland, they were not welcome. In other places, they're not welcome. And Trump's modus operandi for the way he deals with pretty much everyone is to either it's bribery and extortion. It's either, I'll give you something if you give me this, or if you don't give me what I want, I'll threaten you in this way. And this is what he does. Internationally, his entire foreign policy is based on bribery and extortion. And locally within the country, the same sort of structure exists. It's mob. This is how the mob works. This is how the mob—
It reminds me of the way children interact with each other when they're like preschoolers. Like it's all transactional.
Everything is transactional with this administration. Absolutely everything. There is nothing relational at all. There's nothing about trying to bring people together and sort of recognize that we all have to live in the same country type of attitude. And so we should try and get along. Nothing like that whatsoever. Everything is, what does Trump want right now? Because he lives in the eternal now, in the eternal present. It's all about, what do I want that will make me feel better right now? And there's no strategy to any of this from his point of view, but from the point of view of his enablers, there is. From the point of view of his enablers, it's, let's walk into anything that's Democrat controlled and massively destabilize it so that we can use that as an excuse for repression. So this is what's happening right now. And it's
Is this helping him out in the polls, Nicole?
No, it's not. Because the interesting thing is, this time, everyone's on the side of Black Lives Matter. well, not everyone, but far more so. It's got far more general support than it has ever had before. So there've been all kinds of demonstrations before when people have been killed by law enforcement or brutalized in some way, but they've never taken off nationally in the way that they are currently. So actually, what Trump is doing is hurting him in the polls. People are getting very angry about this. People who would never have come out and demonstrated normally are seeing this disproportionate response and saying, I just have to go out and I'll be on the streets of Portland at 2 a.m. in the War of the Leaf Blowers because this is unacceptable.
Now, in our talk that we just finished with Stephanie Rurink, so anybody viewing this first, if you want to learn about mutual aid network, time banks, community currency, and have kind of a discussion on how to do things without money, how to cooperate with neighbors and community and whatnot, take a look at that hour. But you had mentioned evictions and also something about the Congress. Has the Congress still, like months later, not come up with another aid package to the U.S. people?
There's a discussion of another aid package.
Yeah, but there's discussion going on a month ago and 2 months ago, so that doesn't mean anything.
They are bringing out a new aid package, but at the moment, this is a Republican proposal. So I don't know what's going to happen to the details when it actually goes through all the sausage making process in Congress. So I don't know what will come out the other end, but the detail that I was seeing this morning is they're proposing to cut the unemployment from 600 down to 200, the excess unemployment. And this is going to cause a huge problem. So
well, now I thought the 600 was going to run out like at the end of July.
Yeah, it's running out imminently. So they're trying to put in something else, but it's not going to be as generous. So they're going to cut that back. What they're saying is we don't want people being paid more to sit at home than they would be paid at their job. But this is really ridiculous. I mean, there's so many things that have fallen on people's heads, that extra costs for all sorts of things.
Well, I'm confused. Can I stop you just for a minute? What work exactly is it that's not getting done right now that's so desperately important that they have to go? I mean, what is this work that people have to be doing? I mean, I'm not seeing like huge ads in the newspaper or anything. They're like, come and work for me.
Yeah, not at all. The unemployment is massive. So all the people, the essential people, have been working all the way through this, and most of them work for very low wages. So the people who pay, we're really seeing that the people who are paid the least are the only people who are truly essential to the most basic functioning of the country. The whole rafts of jobs are actually pretty surplus to requirements. And the only reason they exist is that people had disposable income. So, businesses arise to serve disposable income. And those businesses are all going to go under when people don't have any disposable income. And a whole lot of jobs are not just going to be non-essential. They're just going to disappear because they don't have any real reason to exist that serves any kind of national purpose. So they serve a purpose of the person who's doing the job earning a living and being able to feed their family. But the existence of that particular function doesn't serve society other than one person not being hungry. But it doesn't serve broad goals.
Now, everybody lives in their own bubble, but in my bubble of people, I'm not hearing a lot of angst about this at the moment, but apparently there is in a lot of places. Mm-hmm. So, where are people getting the most concerned? Is it the people who are on the unemployment must be getting really concerned? Is it, even the housing market where I'm at in Michigan does not seem to be even paying attention to this at the moment. So like there was a house that came up for sale recently and it had 15 people view it on the first day and 4 offers on the first day. And what's going on?
For a lot of people, I think the people who are really feeling it the most are the people who can't make rent. And there are 28 million people on the verge of being evicted from their apartments when the moratorium on evictions runs out. And as I was saying, is
that scheduled to end at the end of July or August, or does it vary?
I'm not completely sure. I would have to look that up. But Basically, there are a huge number of people on the verge of being evicted, and they would all be evicted basically at once. So you would have this enormous number of people suddenly looking for rental properties, and they don't have any money. And if you don't have a fixed address, you can't vote. So I think one of the reasons that the government doesn't want to support people is because they've engaged in a very wide range of voter suppression tactics, and this would be the biggest one yet. So you just put people in a position where they have no right to vote anymore. And they are doing this in umpteen different ways. So there are these hackable voting machines. Voting company executives have access to these machines when the people who are meant to count the votes do not have access to them. I mean, the number of ways that that could be completely fiddled is enormous. But there are also people being kicked off the voter rolls all over the place if signatures don't match exactly, and they're insisting on voter ID. But I remember reading that, I think this was Georgia, but they had done some research into what kind of voter ID would minorities be the least likely to have, and then they require that form of voter ID to be able to vote. So all these ways to undermine the ability of people who would probably vote Democrat from being able to do so. And this, it's just appalling. This is an outright coup that they're trying to engage in right now. This is a right-wing coup in the United States. They don't care about winning the election. They want to steal the election. And they don't care about governing. They want to rule. So this is autocracy. The United States is moving into being an autocratic police state, like very many other.
This sounds so fantastic. Just stepping away from this topic for a couple of weeks, hearing you say that, it just sounds like a fantastical thing. Like, Nicole, you can't be talking about the United States. I mean, we're the United States, Nicole. Everything is great here. I mean, the sun is shining and the grass is green and the lakes are filled with boaters, and everything is just beautiful here. You can't be talking about this United States. Or are you talking about the one down the street or something, or in this downtown cities or something?
Well, I suppose I'm prone to pay attention to these things anyway, but I don't have any of those distractions. So I'm not sitting in the States where it's summer and I might be going boating or anything like that. So all the distractions of normal life that some people are still managing to engage in are not the sort of thing I'm watching at all. I'm not there. They're not relevant to me. But I am relentlessly paying attention to all the things going on under. So the things that are going on in places that most people don't see them, and the things that don't necessarily make the news. So I don't get my view of the world from mainstream news. I'm following individuals in specific places who have skills, background, or are just feet on the ground in a particular place, who are able to describe things and film things and share actual video of what's going on in a particular spot. So these are the kinds of things that I'm following. All the people who really, really know what's going on for whatever reason. Some of that gets into the mainstream news, but often it doesn't. There are a handful of reporters who I think really cover these issues the way that they deserve to be covered, like, say, Greg Sargent at Washington Post would be right up there. He's extremely good. His quality is uniformly high on describing the issues that are going on at the moment. But often these things don't get into the mainstream. So if you don't know who to follow, then it gets very difficult to be able to form that kind of big picture of what's going on. And often these things happen, they're small to start with. So it's one city here. And in fact, despite the fact that Trump would say, oh, it's all of Portland is burning down. No, it's like Seattle. There's a little area in the middle that protesters have taken over around the courthouse.
So when are like the majority of the people in the US likely to actually tune into this stuff going on? Because there's a big group that isn't tuned in,
People have a huge tendency not to pay attention to things that are not affecting them personally. even if there's every reason to think that they will affect those same people personally at some point down the road, people tend not to pay attention until it does affect them. The same thing happened in Germany in the 30s, and all sorts of things were going on, and most people just went on living their lives because it wasn't affecting them. But when it does affect people at the further up the financial food chain, further up the social hierarchy, by the time it's affecting them, it's far too late to do anything about it. So this is why it's really important for people in those positions who are not yet currently affected just to start paying attention to what is going on. I mean, if you look in Portland, the kind of people who are out protesting in Portland right now are exactly those kind of people, higher up the financial food chain, higher up the social hierarchies, and they're out protesting anyway. We're talking about doctors and people like that, and lawyers and professors are protesting in Portland at the moment. People like that need to engage in the rest of the country. And this is a huge problem because often they're being directly told not to. The news is telling them, oh, especially Fox News is telling them it's no big deal, or it's all just a Democratic hoax and a plot, and they're all just trying to get rid of Trump. That's why they're talking about all this bad news. So you get a completely false impression if all you watch is mainstream media. And Fox News is the #1 news station. They are complete propaganda. People who watch only Fox News know less about what's going on in the world than people who watch no news whatsoever, because what they're picking up on Fox News is disinformation. It's not news. And so the difference is misinformation it's incorrect, but not deliberately so. Disinformation is deliberately incorrect. It is deliberately propagating a false impression of what's actually happening. And this is what Fox News does 100% of the time. And occasionally they will have someone on who says something that's worth listening to. Maybe Chris Wallace, maybe Andrew Napolitano. Not consistently, but occasionally they'll have something to say that's worth listening to. The recent interview between Trump and Chris Wallace was definitely worth watching. I wouldn't say that Chris Wallace took it as far as he could have done, but he definitely called Trump on his bullshit in ways that I thought was really helpful. So there are occasionally times when there are things on there worth watching, but most of it is actually making things worse. I think that there are huge problems with the media in the US. So much of it is corporate. It's controlled. It's controlled by the kind of people who almost certainly vote for Trump, because they're the kind of people who benefit from all the financial shenanigans that he's engaging in to put money in the pockets of rich people. The people who own these news corporations are rich people, and they are benefiting from Trump's policies. They're friends with him. People like Jeff Zucker at CNN. That's where Trump got his start, at The Apprentice. They are friends. Trump and CNN are not enemies. They just stage these fake fights for ratings. There's so much going on that is just profoundly pathological. But I think Americans are going to have to start being really proactive about finding out what's going on in their country, to not be passive. I think passivity is a huge problem. People are sitting back, waiting for the news to come to them, waiting for other people to solve the problems. People have been encouraged to upload responsibility for a whole lot of things for a very, very long time. This happens when you get to past human scale. Things get to be so big. I mean, the States is a very large country, 330 million people. When you get to that kind of size, people end up thinking, well, I don't have any control over any of the things that affect my life at my tiny scale. So I'll just upload responsibility for looking after all these centralized life support systems to the higher up powers that be, and then I'll just ignore them because I'll take them for granted and assume they'll always be there. That kind of passivity has got to change. People need to be active. They need to start downloading responsibility. This again ties in with what we were talking with Stephanie about an hour ago, that people have to take responsibility for changing things themselves from the bottom up. And they have to do it en masse. And this is something that is starting to happen with these protests. It is bringing people together in ways that we haven't seen before. So this is not a bunch of hippies out there protesting. It's not just a bunch of young kids who are Antifa, the sort of people you would normally think of as Antifa. This is normal mainstream suburbanites who are starting to come out and say, this is unacceptable. And they're absolutely right. It is. And it's taken a long time for people to start to engage at that level, but I'm glad to see that they finally are. I would very much like to see more people doing it. And I think particularly in the red states, this has to happen, but I can't see how it's going to happen because they're being fed this disinformation all the time. They're constantly being told that the media, everyone is lying to them. They can't trust anyone other than Trump. So they've just decided to trust Trump on pretty much everything. They're buying it hook, line, and sinker. And this is just turning into an absolute disaster. And I don't think it'll be until people in red states really start to see the impact of the pandemic and all the evictions and everything else that's going to happen. I don't think it'll be till they start to see it affect them that they're really going to care. And I'm not even sure they're going to turn against Trump at that point, because there comes a point where you've invested so much emotionally in following a particular person in a cult of personality that absolutely nothing would make these people change their minds. So that's where you get to a sort of death cult. You get a sort of Jim Jones kind of thing going on. These people are with him to the end, and they are prepared to be violent in defense of that ideology. Or it's not really an ideology, it's just a cult of personality, but nevertheless, they are prepared to die for it. And that is extremely disturbing. This is the kind of reason that I think that there's no way to avoid an outbreak of widespread violence, because there are people who are not basically living in the same country. It's geographically the same, but the media ecosystem that feeds these groups of people is absolutely different. They have almost nothing in common at all. The reality that the people live in red states, if they're only watching Fox News, is not at all the same reality that everybody else is living in. And this is how it becomes almost impossible to talk to people on the other side of the fence, because they're living their reality and others are living theirs, and they just have nothing in common. So there's no basis for finding common ground. And this has all been absolutely deliberate. This has been deliberately driven. This kind of division has been deliberately created over the last 3.5 years in order to achieve exactly what has been achieved now. Now, in 2014, Trump actually went on Fox News and said, basically, he was talking about wanting to be involved in politics, but he said, well, what you really need is riots everywhere. When you have riots everywhere, then we can crack down on that and go back to being how we were when we were great. I'm paraphrasing. That wasn't an exact quote, it weren't exact words that he used, because I can't remember the exact words. But nevertheless, that was the spirit of what he said on Fox News in 2014. Sarah Kendzior covered this in her book, Hiding in Plain Sight, which I thoroughly recommend to everybody, by the way. This is exactly what he's been aiming for, to be able to provoke unrest and then crack down. He loves violence. Violence, he gets off on violence like you would not believe, because he is so pathological, so psychologically disturbed, that this is one of the things that he actually gets aroused by, is the idea of violence, death, pain, and suffering. You know, how America managed to vote a psychopath into office is appalling, but they did, and some of them are now realizing it, and others not yet. But this has been the idea from the beginning: foment civil war, crack down, cause a lot of suffering, and then enrich yourself enormously by owning everything, exactly the same way that the Soviet Union collapsed. So the people who were in power at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union were able to privatize pretty much everything for a song. They just claimed huge chunks of what had been the Soviet state. And sometimes they paid a little bit for it, but never anywhere near what these things were worth. The state was just carved up by the nomenklatura, who were the Soviet insiders at the time. The exact same thing will happen in the States. The oligarchs, the new American oligarchs, will be formed by carving up parts of the state and simply taking it into private ownership, so that there won't be the kind of public space that there is now. This is what collapses look like. You get to the point where the central state has been weakened to the point where it can be taken over by a demagogue. And that's exactly what's happening in the States right now. It's what happened in Russia when Putin took over as well. Sometimes demagogues can be effective in terms of law and order, in terms of getting things calmed down, but then things turn into a kleptocracy, a mafia state. This is exactly what's happened to the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union in the recent years. And this is exactly the path that the States is going to follow as well for a while. It doesn't mean that everything will go downhill forever and everything will be universally bad. No, it doesn't. It means that the system at the top, the governing system, is going to try and impose huge amounts of power that are wildly unconstitutional. And whatever people do that's positive, they'll have to do in spite of that. So the government will be a force for making things worse for a very, very long time. People are going to have to come together at the grassroots level to create the change they want. And they're going to have to do it in spite of the government. And the government will be a threat to what they're trying to do. Maybe less so once Trump is no longer there, and he won't be there forever because he's 74 and he has huge health issues anyway. But if they manage to steal the election, it won't much matter whether he's there or not. The people who've been enabling him will simply take over and continue the trajectory towards totalitarianism. The only way to short circuit that is for the Democrats to win the election. I don't know exactly how they're going to do that. And I don't think they actually have a whole lot of solutions, by the way. So when I say the Democrats need to win the election, I'm not saying that because I think they're going to somehow save the day and completely change the country. No, I don't at all. I just think they would be people who at least wouldn't make it any worse. They wouldn't deliberately make it any worse than it has to be, whereas the Republicans will. So I don't think any government is a solution in any way, but some governments will actively make things worse and some will not. So if you have to vote for government, vote for one that at least won't make things worse, or at least not deliberately. So that's a start.
Now, Donald's niece was going to publish her book. What's going on with that?
The book came out. She's done a number of really revealing interviews on all sorts of mainstream media. She was on Maddow. She's done a lot of media work, and
okay.
She's
so what is she saying in the book and in the interviews?
She's basically saying that Trump was raised in the most dysfunctional family environment just about imaginable. That his father was a high-functioning sociopath. And his mother was ill from when he was quite young. Excuse me for one moment. So his mother was essentially absent a lot of the time. He was being raised by a sociopathic father whose idea was to instill a killer instinct, to teach him to lie and cheat and steal and be all style over substance, but to make as much money as possible. And so what she was saying is that Donald was actually a lot better at all that kind of bluster and public face projection of things than his father was. So that was his role in Trump.org when his father was still running it, was to be the public face, the smarmy public face of the Trump.org. But he didn't have the substance that his father had. So what Mary Trump would say was, whereas Fred Trump was a high-functioning sociopath, Donald Trump is just a sociopath. He's barely functional at all, in her view. She says that essentially he has been institutionalized his entire life. So because he's been so surrounded by structures that have protected him, so from his father's business to all the mafia contacts, to just being part of larger systems all the time, that where he was the public face, but he wasn't the one who was actually making all the decisions. There was a structure around him that was protecting him, that allowed him to fail upwards all the time. So every time he failed, and he did these copious numbers of times, he just went on to something even better. He never took the losses. He always managed to dump the losses on other people and go on to something even bigger. And that's exactly what he's done again. And again, he's being enabled. He exists in a bubble where he doesn't even know what's going on in the country. He's basically just lost it, mostly. So he's not the one who's running things at this point. And there's discussion that actually Bill Barr is the one who's really taking charge of how how this paramilitary forces around the country are playing out. So it seems that Bill Barr is actually making a lot of the very significant decisions, as well Jared Kushner. Trump is even more of a figurehead at this point than he's always been in other things. And he's being even more enabled and coddled. They're practically having to prop him up. He has so many neurological issues. And Mary Trump says his pathologies are so complex and overwhelming that it would actually take a team of psychologists weeks to tease it all out, and he would never sit for the tests. So it's never going to happen. I mean, Mary Trump is a PhD clinical psychologist. She understands these issues really, really well. And I would thoroughly recommend her book. I would thoroughly recommend that people watch the interviews with her as well.
Now, the ones who are supporting Donald, they are probably saying something about Mary regarding Mary has some ulterior motive. She just wants the money from the book. I mean, what are they saying about her? Are they saying anything that is substantially, like, you know, in a debate where you have strong arguments and weak arguments, and you're supposed to only use the strong arguments so that they won't poke holes in the weak ones that you offer up and only focus on those. So what are the strong arguments, if there are any, for, oh, Mary's book is, you know, just a work of fiction?
Well, I don't think they can really say that. What they might say, and I don't think this is true, but I would expect them to say it. I would expect them to say she's bitter because she was cheated out of her inheritance. And her father was driven to an early grave. Her father was Fred Trump's eldest son, who was also Fred Jr. So her father was the one who was supposed to be groomed for the role in the company. He was supposed to take over his father's company. But he didn't have that mindset at all. She says her father was a kind and generous person. And those qualities were regarded as negative by Fred Trump Sr. So her father had tried to live up to his father's expectations, failed to do so, and went off and became a pilot instead. But he ended up just being a broken alcoholic who died in his 40s because he just could not meet his father's expectations. And so when he died, and then Fred Sr. died as well, the other 4 siblings cheated Fred Jr.'s children out of their share of the inheritance. So they said the estate was worth about 30 million. It was actually worth $1 billion. So she and her brother were both cheated out of their share of the inheritance. So I would expect them to come out with, she's just bitter because of this. I don't think that's remotely true. I find her extremely credible. And, you know, very, very much so. She is an authoritative voice on what went on in that family and the effects it's having, the kind of person that family produced, and why all those pathologies are so dangerous in this particular moment. So I think she absolutely should be paid attention to. And I think her book went #1 on Amazon, and it got more pre-order sales than anything else Simon & Schuster have ever put out in their entire history. So a lot of people will be reading this book. And I think that will help give people more insight into what's actually going on.
What's the name of the book?
Too Much and Never Enough. How My Family Produced the Most Dangerous Man in the World, by Mary L. Trump. So that one, and Hiding in Plain Sight by Sarah Kendzior, that's another one that I think is an absolute must read. I mean, so that follows Trump's career, and the detail, the swampy detail in Sarah's book is just amazing. So yeah, she's a scholar of authoritarianism, so definitely follow her. I would follow Anne Applebaum, who's written a lot on Eastern fascism. She's absolutely
tell me that one again, the one you just said.
Anne Applebaum?
No, the one before that.
Sarah Kendzior.
What was her title?
Kendzior, Hiding in Plain Sight.
And that's about him as well?
Yes.
And
it's not just about him, much broader than that. But
what is the summary of that book? I mean, what's the major point of it?
She's a scholar of authoritarianism. So what she's been doing is pointing out the parallels between the way the things have been going in the US, not just in relation to Trump, but broader than that. She's pointing out the parallels between that and what happened in the states of former Soviet Central Asia, where she did her PhD. So she looked at the slide into despotism of the countries in Soviet Central Asia, and then Russia as well. And so that's her background, and she's drawing out all the parallels between that and what's happening now in the States.
And then who is the third one you were mentioning?
Anne Applebaum.
And did she write a book as well, or?
She's written many, many books. She's also a scholar of fascism. She's lived all over the world and written a whole lot of things that are absolutely worth reading. And Seth Abramson's books, of course, I would really recommend. I mean, they're probably drier. I haven't sort of managed to wade through everything, but I follow Seth on Twitter, so I know what's in them anyway. But they are chapter and verse, 2,500 pages, chapter and verse, meticulously sourced of everything that's happened in the last 3.5 years that people really need to be aware of. So I absolutely recommend those as well. And there are so many others. I could put together a list if I think about it a little bit longer. But you know, people have a whole lot of waking up to do to things that have been going on. A lot of things that have been going on for a long time, and going back to the Patriot Act and things like that. And these are all things that were chipping away at the constitutional order. And that's been going on for decades. This didn't start with Trump. So Trump has inherited something that wasn't a police state, but had the seeds of a police state sown within it. And he's just been watering those seeds like crazy and encouraging them to grow. So he wouldn't have been able to do what he has done if some of the machinery wasn't already there. So the states has been moving in that direction of a stronger executive and less power, less distributed power, stronger and stronger central power for quite a long time. So Trump has just stepped in and inherited that, and is now blown through all the norms and conventions that constrained previous presidents' behavior, because he doesn't follow norms and conventions. He doesn't even follow laws, let alone norms and conventions. So he's just blown out the whole order. And if it doesn't stop in November, then the United States will not be the same country. It will be too late. And the United States will probably never have another president. It will probably be an empire like Rome. So Rome went from being a democracy to being an empire. And I would very much expect that to happen to the States if his administration is not removed. If there isn't a change of power in November, then I think it will be too late, and the States will become a completely different kind of place. I think it'll be much more oligarchic. I think there'll be much less of a middle class, and the people at the top will push their power around even more than they already do, temporarily, until they find themselves on the wrong end of a pitchfork, because that will happen at some point. They will push people just too far, and then there will be a revolution, but not anytime soon. I think it takes a long time before you get to the point where you would see something like that happen. But I do think that they will consolidate power if they win. If they steal, if they will not win it, but if they steal this election successfully, then the United States will be a very, very different place, and not for the better.
So what else is going on, like in the world news? I know the topic is the USA and what's going on in the USA, social unrest in the USA, but what about in general in the world? Like, are there things going on in the last month or so that are like, wow, that's interesting, or that's big news?
Well, I mean, Europe has done incredibly well with their COVID suppression techniques. It is coming back a bit now. I mean, you expect waves in a pandemic, but Europe has handled this really well, and a lot of other countries have too. So that's been the absolutely fascinating, watching how countries have been able to tackle this, and to see how different cultures have fared differently in being able to do it. So I found that really interesting. China is taking over Hong Kong again. So that's something reasonably recent, not like in the last couple of days, but China is moving into Hong Kong and is probably going to take full control over it again. So they did have two systems. This tagline was one country, two systems, but that's basically going to go out the window. Wouldn't surprise me whatsoever if China also decided that they've had enough of this Taiwanese independence and things like that, and maybe Macau. And I think so. I think China is moving into an expansion phase, a mentality of expansionism anyway, even more so than they have done it. They've been doing that a lot with investing, particularly in Africa, building infrastructure in Africa and then controlling it and things. So there's been an expansion dynamic anyway in China, but I think it's starting to move into higher gear. And this could put it into conflict with the US. At the moment, it's interesting because you have both countries that are going to end up being, I think, totalitarian at some point. And they have some things in common, some interests in common. For instance, the producer and the consumer of last resort. I mean, that's a symbiotic relationship. China has produced a whole lot of plastic crap that Americans pay huge amounts of money for that has provided employment in China. So if Americans don't have money and they can't buy Chinese plastic crap, then a whole lot of Chinese people lose their jobs. And then you end up with unrest in China because things are not going well. And the other thing in China at the moment is flooding like you would not believe on an absolutely biblical scale. So this could actually have huge consequences because it's threatening the Three Gorges Dam. So it's interesting. I was looking at a picture of the dam this morning compared to a picture of
is that huge dam that was built, say, 10 years ago or something, and it flooded like the size of a state.
Yes.
And they had to move everybody out of there and resettle people. And
the dam is currently the reservoir behind the dam is currently at 50 feet above maximum flood level. And the dam is distorting. If you look at pictures of it when it was new versus now, I was looking at one this morning and it was like this to begin with, as you would expect. Now it's sort of wobbly. It's a wavy line of concrete that when you look down on it from above, it's rather disturbing. So the problem is that they're letting water spill through this dam in almost unbelievable amounts. So downstream, there is epic flooding already. But if the dam actually goes, it may not. It could withstand this. But if it doesn't, and there's a possibility that it won't, then that would basically flood an area inhabited by 400 million people. It would take out a third of China's electricity production instantly, and it would destroy almost all their capacity to produce food. It's already done that to a large extent, just with all the overspill from the dam. There's already, crops have just been wiped out across China. So this is going to be a problem globally, because the US has all this issue with the two food streams, the retail and the non-retail, restaurants and hotels and things, and they've had to plow a bunch of food in because all the non-retail sector just collapsed. So there's a setup for food shortages in the US as well, simply because an enormous amount of food got wasted. And also it may not be possible to get the number of people to come in and harvest food that you normally would have without causing huge outbreaks of disease. So there may be problems with food in the US. There are definitely going to be problems with food in China. Russia has a huge COVID problem as well. I don't know to what extent that's affecting their ability to produce food, but it could be. And so you're looking at all the breadbaskets of the world, so to speak, are going to have problems. This is a setup for huge spikes in food prices because people who can't produce food themselves are going to try and buy it from somewhere else. But if everybody's competing for the same food supplies, then food prices could go through the roof. All the more reason for people to try and go for food sovereignty if they possibly can. I mean, you're not likely to achieve total food sovereignty, no matter what you do, unless you have a huge farm. But you can provide for some of what you eat. You can at least have a lot of people, not everyone again, but even if you have a balcony, you can probably grow something. On the balcony of your apartment, you can hang tomatoes that will happily grow upside down and things like that. You can save a bit of
something that
I learned, my wife is the one who is doing most of the gardening right now, but we put in a larger garden than we put in a long time. And I discovered that the potatoes grow slowly.
They do.
I thought the potatoes would be, like a month and they're ready. No, no,
Root
no, no.
vegetables all grow slowly.
No, those they grow so slowly, but the zucchini is doing great. And the
Oh,
cucumbers
yeah.
and the tomatoes are coming up now. And boy, those they don't require a lot of effort. Not really.
Oh, they
I mean,
don't. Everyone
bit
should
of-
grow zucchini. You can grow zucchini on your balcony. We did. We don't have a balcony. We have a deck out front. We don't have a garden where we are. So we have a big deck out front and we have pots on our deck. So we're growing a few things. It's winter now, so we're not really growing right now. But in the summer, we were growing silver beet and tomatoes and raspberries and rhubarb and all sorts of things we had out there. And it was really nice being able to just walk out onto the deck and pick things and put them in what I was cooking that evening.
Hey, can I read you some headlines from Reddit news?
Feel free.
Geslaine Maxwell, longtime friend and confidant of Jeffrey Epstein, has been arrested by the FBI and charged by federal prosecutors.
And she's being charged under the public corruption section of SDNY, which is interesting because this means she's not just being investigated for sex trafficking. She's being investigated for her role in public corruption, because she and Epstein ran a blackmail factory, a compromat factory. The idea was you get all these powerful people, you praise them, flatter them, fly them to your private island, and then show them pretty young girls and then film everything. So there were cameras everywhere on that island.
It sounds like a movie, where you have like a sting operation and they set up the cameras and has no one ever watched a movie that was like one of the participants in this stuff? I mean, how are people that naive to think that?
I honestly don't know how they could have been that naive, but hundreds of them were, apparently. And it's interesting.
I'm not talking about the young women. I'm talking about the Johns, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. You'd think, how could they be this naive? But they were, hundreds of them, because they had compromat on an enormous number of people. Now the Department of Justice has all the compromat, by the way. So now they have the ability to be even more mob than they were before, because they now have all the compromising information on everybody's politicians, not just Americans.
What's the long-term impact of this information then? Is this good news or bad news?
It's high time that they arrested her, because I personally think they've known where she was all the time. And the thought that someone who has committed crimes that egregious could just be living privately in the United States, no problem at all, is really quite appalling in itself. She was arrested in New Hampshire. She bought in cash some mansion there, and that's where she was picked up. But she could bring down hundreds of powerful people from all over the world. So the question is she going to be Epsteined? Is she going to survive to trial? Right now, the judge is deciding what documents to unseal. So this could be really interesting, because if those documents get unsealed, all those names will be in the public domain. There are a lot of people who want that not to happen.
So another one of the headlines, this is from 4 days ago from CNN. Judge rules to unseal documents in 2015 case against Geslaine Maxwell, Jeffrey Epstein's alleged accomplice. Yes. So he's deciding which ones to unseal.
Yes. And they might all be unsealed, but who knows whether the judge will have pressure put upon him, or maybe be removed from this life if he doesn't agree. So because the kind of power that you're talking about, the kind of people involved in this scandal are very, very powerful, and would not be at all above threatening and removing obstacles. So it will be interesting to see how this plays out, whether the justice system actually gets an opportunity to work the way it's supposed to, or whether everything gets covered up, swept under the rug, and things again. I think with the amount of power involved, it's pretty unlikely that we're going to see the full story, because at least some people will be powerful enough to prevent their actions coming to light. I don't know if everybody will, but some people probably will. Prince Andrew is up to his neck in it, and he's not cooperating at all with the investigation, which is grotesque. He's a very entitled, nasty piece of work, is Prince Andrew.
And I think we've talked about Maxwell quite a bit in previous weeks. Here's another headline from actually 18 days ago. Supreme Court rules New York prosecutor can get Trump's tax returns. Any progress on that?
Well, I mean, basically, they were told they were allowed to get the tax. Cy Vance in New York was allowed to get the tax returns, but Trump has now gone back to SCOTUS with an appeal to put it differently, because SCOTUS had given him an opportunity to change the way he was structuring the complaint, and gave them a hint that it might be a different outcome if he did it that way. So it might possibly be reversed. I certainly hope not, but I'm not as optimistic as I would like to be about this, partly because Cy Vance is corrupt himself. So he's already let Don Jr. and Ivanka off the hook for corruption charges that he was planning to file against them long before Trump became president.
Is Cy Vance the New York prosecutor?
He's the New York DA, yeah. So he's the New York's sort of the one who is filing this anyway, and he is not someone to be trusted to follow the rule of law. He dropped charges against Trump's kids in exchange for donations. So he's already demonstrated that he's corrupt. So it depends which side does he think his bread is buttered on this time? Previously, his bread was buttered on the side of making Trump's life easier because they both lived in New York and Trump had a lot of power in New York. Who knows this time? The walls seem to be cracking with the Trump phenomenon at the moment. The base is shrinking and more people are starting to say, wait a minute here, this is just not okay. And you're starting to see more pushback from the media, even from Fox News. So Cy Vance may decide that his bread is no longer buttered on the side of making Trump's life easier. But on the other hand, he could just be put in an impossible position where there are people on both sides who are going to make his life difficult no matter what he does. So I wouldn't want to be him right now, I don't think. But it'll be interesting to see whether that comes out.
Here's another headline that got 117,000 thumbs up or lifts on Reddit. Nike, Amazon, Apple, Abercrombie, among those using Uyghur Muslim forced labor in China.
It doesn't surprise me, sadly. So the Uyghur people in Western China, they're Turkic people. They're not Han Chinese, and they're Muslim. So they're ethnically and religiously distinct from the Han Chinese. And they are being appallingly mistreated at the moment. Millions of them have been rounded up and sent to concentration camps. Trump greenlighted this in order to get a trade deal with China. This is another absolutely huge and appalling scandal. It's another bribery thing. You give me a trade deal, I won't give you a hard time over putting 2 million Muslims in concentration camps. That kind of quid pro quo is how Trump runs his entire life and everything in it. And he always has done. That's this mob way of dealing with things. So this is going on in China right now. They're being forced to convert. Their children are being taken away and converted into other things. It's an attempt to erase their culture from existence. To not necessarily kill them all, although I'm sure they wouldn't mind killing them all, but to erase their culture and their religion, to turn them into Chinese standard automatons or something, I suppose, to be able to just function the way everybody else does in China. And I mean, this is absolutely appalling. It's a huge crime against humanity, what they're doing. One of the largest in history, really. I mean, we used to oppose concentration camps, I remember, some decades ago. And now the thought that an American president would greenlight concentration camps for millions of people is just absolutely appalling. And not nearly enough Americans know about it.
So how is Europe doing?
Well, Europe is going to have huge problems. It's managing to get its COVID more or less under control and things, but I really don't think Europe is going to be stable in the long term. I just think there are too many things that are happening with the bubble bursting. I think that's going to take down governments in Europe, and ultimately, I think it's going to bring down the EU, which is very sad because I absolutely love Europe, and being able to just travel around it, no borders and things, and no need to change currency and make friends all over the place. I loved that. I lived in Europe for 12 years and traveled all over it, and I think it's an absolutely fabulous place. But I think it's got so many problems at the moment that I can't see that large political structure being able to maintain its structural integrity. I just think the trust horizon is going to shrink too far, and people in different countries are not going to trust each other anymore. And already, I mean, with COVID, you get borders up again, you get lockdowns and movement restrictions, even within countries, let alone between them. And I think while the pandemic is still around, even although Europe has done quite well with it, they're not going to have the same kind of freedom of movement that they've had up to now. And I think that's the first step to bringing back those borders, sadly. I hate to think of that happening to Europe, but unfortunately, I don't really see any other option.
Let's see. Here's one from yesterday. Black armed protesters march in Kentucky demanding justice for Breonna Taylor.
Yeah, she was an EMT, and so the police were after someone who I think was in her building or nearby. They came to the wrong house. They broke into her apartment and killed her in her own bed. And no one has been arrested for this. They were in the wrong house after the wrong person. So it was a mistaken identity, but they killed an innocent person who posed no threat whatsoever, and there have been no consequences for this. So this is what people are very upset about. That if someone in a position of authority abuses their authority in a way that is completely outside the bounds of what they're allowed to do, then there should be legal consequences for that, and there haven't been. So Breonna Taylor died some time ago, I think before George Floyd, but she's one of the people who is the focus of the Black Lives Matter protests.
I was just looking to see if there's anybody else that was killed recently. Let's see.
There was another one a couple of months ago who I think he'd fallen asleep in his car at a drive-through and tried to run away, and they shot him in the back and killed him. But I can't remember his name.
Yeah. Well, I was looking more recently. So this month it says, I'm looking on Wikipedia. It says Vincent Harris of Louisiana, Malcolm Como of Texas on the 17th, David Martin of Colorado on the 17th, Aaron Ulsvik on the 16th in Washington, Chase Roundtree, 33 in Texas on the 16th, Tyler Blevins in Kentucky. So there's just a list of various people that have been killed. It looks like about 16 so far this month in the USA.
Of course, are bringing up Tamir Rice and Trayvon Martin, and as they should. These were several years ago, but still, it's part of the same phenomenon that police end up killing Black people. They say that they feel that they're under threat, but some of these people were children playing in their own back garden and things. So the thought that a police officer would feel that their life was under threat from a 12-year-old Black kid playing with a toy gun in his own back garden is just ridiculous. And it's not like they even gave him an opportunity. They shot him about 2 seconds after they called his name. So these things are just ridiculous. And I can absolutely see why these protests are happening. They should have been happening before, I think. But the interesting thing is that now more mainstream populations are getting behind these protests than was previously the case. This is why I think they're going to get a lot more traction than they have done before.
So here are a couple more recent ones regarding the police. So this one's from a day ago from AP News. ProPublica posts New York Police Department records bypassing judges' blockade. And then from 5 days ago, Philadelphia SWAT officer seen pepper spraying kneeling protesters on 676 turns himself in to be charged. So
yeah, I mean, there have been so many things that have happened at these Portland protests. I have a whole series of pictures of people they've shot their eyes out deliberately. They've blinded people. Like, they're using these things with sights. They have laser sights on them. They know that they're targeting people for headshots. There was one just recently, a young man. He was standing in the middle of the street in Portland holding a boombox over his head. They shot him in the head. He has brain damage. There's another one. She's a professor. They shot her in the side of the face, and she's still in hospital. And there are so many of these things that are happening. There are some of the most gruesome pictures of people where an eye used to be, there's now a bunch of metal balls falling out of it from a beanbag round. I mean, just the most disgusting pictures. But these are the things that are happening to people. People are being thrown to the ground. They're being injured deliberately. People who are not doing anything, not committing any crime whatsoever, just walking along. Sometimes they're not even part of the protest. They've attacked people who were just bystanders, or they've attacked journalists or legal observers. And it's just completely out of control what the feds are doing. It's complete abuse of power at this point. And it's going to get worse before it gets better.
So the headlines, if I type in injured protesters in Portland, the Washington Post headline is protests explode across the country, police declare riots in Seattle, Portland. New York Times says fire and pepper spray in Seattle as police protests widen across the US. Fox News says rifle ammunition, Molotov cocktails found by police, Portland police responding to shooting.
The police and well, even more so the feds, more so than the police, but they've been provoking people. They've been starting this. So you get a bunch of people in Portland waving their phones around with their flashlight, singing, basically doing the equivalent of singing Kumbaya. You know, these are not threatening people. This is not a protest that's violent. They're not trying to damage anything. Some of the protesters, when things get a little more heated later on in the evening, they throw fireworks at the courthouse. But this is a very solid building, and these fireworks are not doing any damage. It's just an expression of protest. But then they get all the tear gas back. Tear gas is not allowed in war, but they're using it against protests and protesters. This is just ridiculous. The injuries they're causing people are just gruesome in some cases. And people who are just trying to help. I mean, and they're attacking medics. They're destroying medical supplies and things because they don't want these protesters to be helped when they're injured. It's absolutely appalling, and it's being instigated by the feds. Things were calming down in Portland, and before the feds went in there, things were not in a bad state. Now they are. And now it's starting in Seattle as well. Chicago and Albuquerque are on the list as well. And New York, as far as I know, Bill de Blasio has said he won't allow it in New York, but I have no idea whether he actually has the capacity to prevent it. So we shall see. But I am very much expecting this to take off in blue cities around the country over the next few months, because he wants a pretext for civil war. He wants martial law. He wants to crack down. If he declares martial law up front, then people are likely to object more. So this is kind of an end run around the need to declare martial law formally by just having all these unmarked federal officers of one kind or another do the job unofficially. So what we have now is unofficial martial law in some cities. What I would expect is for that to expand to many other cities and then to become official martial law probably sometime before the election. That would be my best guess at this point.
And this is a real thing in the USA in 2020.
Unfortunately, yes.
And again, it just sounds so fantastic. I mean, even not paying attention to it for, a little while, and you're like, this can't, you're Nicole, you're just spinning tales of fiction right now, because I mean, it's like the whole internet is fictional, because you go on Reddit and there's like this stuff and you're like, that can't be true. And then listen to you talk, and I'm like, yeah, that can't be true either. But it's just so,
Everything is beautiful. It's summer, and you
it is. It's
go
beautiful
outside and
outside.
have a picnic, and all seems right with the world in a local area. But things
Well,
that
there's a lot of people that don't like news, especially in the summer. They don't want to be bothered by
it's the silly.
crazy.
The summer is the silly season. Everyone wants to be on holiday and just having fun, and they don't want to be thinking about really serious issues. And unfortunately, if they don't engage, then they're going to lose their country as they know it. And that, not to put too fine a point on it, that is what's at stake. If people don't engage and prevent this coup, they will lose their country as they know it. And it's never coming back as they knew it. So the stakes are pretty darn high at this point, I would say. I mean, when you elect a psychopath to office, there are consequences. And if he really thinks he's going to lose, people with his pathology would be inclined to burn it all down. It's like, if I can't have it, no one else will either. Hitler tried the same thing. He wanted, at the end of the war, when it was obvious he was going to lose, he wanted his own army to destroy his own country's infrastructure, so there would be nothing there for the Allies to take or to take over. And so the country would be impossible to run because the infrastructure would all be destroyed. And his own generals were saying, your own people are going to starve if you destroy everything in the country. And he said, I don't care. They didn't support me enough. They deserve it. Trump will do the same. I think this is just how people like that operate. That's the way their minds work. People who know they're on their way out, why should anyone else get to stay behind and have fun? It's this kind of incredibly negative, destructive attitude that only someone who has that kind of pathology would ever really think. It's almost impossible for ordinary people to put themselves in the mind of someone like that, because it's hard to imagine what it would be like to not have a conscience, to have zero empathy, to literally not care at all if people die, and to actually enjoy watching them suffer. This is the kind of mentality that America elected. And there are massive consequences for that. So one of my friends on Facebook, who was actually someone I went to middle school with, who is very conservative, and now he's Canadian, but he lives in the States. And he's saying, you just put up 3 years of a constant scream on your Facebook page. And he thinks it's all ridiculous, of course. And I would say, well, there's a reason for that, because I'm trying to get through to people how serious this is, what this pathology is, and what it means for the way things will play out. And I've been trying to point out all the little steps on the road to fascism. So it doesn't happen full blown out of nothing. It comes a bit at a time. It's a boiling frog kind of scenario. And there are trial balloons for fascism all the time. He does something, sees what reaction is. If it's bad, he pulls back a bit and then tries it again a bit more later on, see if he can get away with it then. If it works well, he'll push further. This is how these things work. And I've been trying to communicate that, but it's very difficult for people who don't have the background in really all of the big picture to really see why this would be true. Because people say, well, my life doesn't look like that, and I don't see any of these things going on, and how could this possibly be true? But it comes from engaging at a very deep level for a very, very long time. And in my case, it's been decades. I mean, it's probably been at least 35 years that I've been doing what I do. And so I have a big picture that I've developed from doing that, paying attention relentlessly for 35 years. And so people who haven't had the opportunity to do that, it's not necessarily they didn't want to, but people don't always have the opportunity to do something like that. But so they don't have the same picture in their head that I do. And they're not necessarily seeing these things that are happening as part of a pattern. So when I see these things happening that are stepping stones on the road to fascism, I will immediately recognize them for what they are, because I have the background to do that. But other people don't, because to them, they're just isolated incidents, and they're not connected in people's minds. So because they don't have the background to see why they would be connected, they see them as isolated incidents, and then it's hard to make sense of isolated incidents unless you see a pattern to it. And there is a pattern, but it's not a pattern that's going to be obvious to everybody. So I might try and actually put together a reading list for people who really want to see what sort of things are coming and why. I think it's because I think people really, really need to engage. Otherwise, it is going to be too late. And then everything is just going to get so much harder. I mean, even if it's too late, it still won't mean there's nothing you can do. You can still do all the things Stephanie was talking about. Under the radar, at the local level, grassroots. It doesn't mean the world ends. That's not what I mean by saying it's too late. I mean that the country will no longer be a republic under the Constitution. It will be a different kind of country. It will be an oligarchy, a totalitarian oligarchy. So it will operate in a very different way. And people will then have to change the way they live their lives in accordance with a very, very different political system that they're not going to like at all. So it means that everything that people have to do under the radar is going to get harder, because when you have totalitarianism, you no longer have the rule of law. So because the people at the top stop following the laws, the people at the bottom stop doing it too. And then the people at the top will say, well, if you're not going to follow the laws by yourself, we're going to make you. And in order to make you, we have to know what you're doing at all times to see when you might be breaking these laws. So we will now have a surveillance state. So this is how these things come in. So you end up with being watched all the time. China has this as well. I don't know if you know about the Chinese social credit system, but basically
Yeah,
China—
we've talked about that before, yeah.
Yes, so that's the sort of way it's going. I think one of the reasons that the conservatives don't like face masks is because they interfere with facial recognition software. So they make it harder to have a surveillance state if everybody's wearing a mask. So that's just an aside, but there are these little details that just fit. When you start to look at a bigger picture, things start to make sense that wouldn't necessarily make sense if you look at it in isolation. So I do think we're going to see much more surveillance. I think we're going to see much more force applied to people, less choice, less freedom. But people will still find ways. People always have. I mean, even under the Nazis in occupied France, they still had the resistance. You know, people still will come together and will do things and will try to change the system from the bottom up. And they succeeded in Europe in the Second World War. They may well succeed in America too. But there's going to be a period that they're not going to like in the middle. There's going to be something that people are going to need to resist. And the sooner people realize that that's what's coming and sort of wake up to what they might have to do, I would say probably the better. I'm sure this all sounds like it's coming right out of left field.
Well, I mean, I think it really depends on the viewer, you know, because the viewer is going to be like, now one of our viewers who's live right now would really like that reading list. Do you have that available?
I will make one. So I gave a couple of examples, but I will make one. I will go through and, because I have my library, some of it's in boxes, so I can't get to all of it, but the more recent things are still all on my shelves somewhere. So I will go around and I will come up with a reading list for things like this. So I will, if we're on next week, I'll get it to you then.
Yes, well, I'm good for next week, so.
Yeah, I am too. I'll try and get my friend Shani Graham to participate in one of these. So she's Australian from Fremantle. Well, she's Canadian, actually. She was born in Canada, but she lives in Australia and has done for a long time. But she's another one who is one of the most phenomenal forces of nature for the formation of community that you could possibly imagine. So I will, and I'm sure she will do it. So we'll have to find a time that works for Perth, Australia, so, and New Zealand and Michigan. It might be a little complicated. I think Perth is 5 hours different from me. It's 5 hours behind me.
So we might have to start a little bit later so that she's awake.
Possibly. Yeah, so or find a different kind of time that works, but yes.
Okay, well, if you want to set that up, that'd be awesome.
I will do that.
Yeah.
My little friend is here to tell me he's hungry.
I like the idea of having, like, I know in the previous hour I didn't say much of anything, but I was happy for you two to have your little.
Well, I know Stephanie.
Your conversation, I shouldn't use the word little. Your very interesting conversation.
Stephanie is absolutely fascinating. I think it would be a good idea to do one with her and Annalise Hall. So Annalise is from New Zealand, and she went over, she was part of the conference that Stephanie came to New Zealand for. Then she went to America and toured around America with Stephanie, trying to instigate mutual network things all over the country. And Annalise is amazing as well. So I think it would actually be a good, and Annalise is an interviewer. She does journalism. So she would actually be really good to have a discussion of what happened on that tour between the two of them. I think would be absolutely excellent for Local Futures. So I might see if I can set that up too.
Yeah,
And
I mean, the more the merrier. I think the more voices we bring in that are voices of clear thinking, clear-headedness, people who can see what's going on and what the positive things that people can be doing, you know, connecting with neighbors and putting in their garden and, you know, making sure that they have prepared for uncertain times in the future and, you know.
mm-hmm. I'm sure I can put together quite a few people. So,
yeah,
yeah,
okay, so
I will do my best.
okay.
Well,
Well,
I'll see
I
what
think,
I can set up for next week anyway.
well, I think that's probably good for today. How are you feeling? I know you have a cold.
Yeah,
So
I think I probably need to stop just because I'm really not very well at the moment. And so I think I need to lie down for a little while.
okay, well, thank you so much for all of your time. 2.5 hours again, Nicole. For those of you who haven't watched the first hour, that's on a separate video. That's with Stephanie Rurik and Nicole Foss and myself, but it's mostly Stephanie and Nicole talking. If you have not yet clicked thumbs up, please do so we know that you're out there, and go ahead and put a comments in the comments. If you're watching, go ahead and read the dialogue along the side. What else should I say? Yeah, and go look at the other Local Future videos, especially take a look at Nicole's lectures. Like, she has some lectures and Q&As from 5-10 years ago, which are really interesting, talking about the big picture and why things in the future are going to be different for most people from the way they are today or in the recent past. So any final word from you, Nicole?
Well, I'm just looking forward to keeping doing this because I just think this is absolutely what needs to happen, that we need to get the information out there. Now is the time to be trying to build these connections. It will be harder if we wait. It will be so much harder because when people end up in a state where they're angry and afraid and suspicious of everyone and they don't know what anybody's motives are, it is so much harder to bring people together. If you can bring them together when they're in a good frame of mind, they will stay together when things get difficult. But if you let people stay atomized right into a crisis, then trying to bring them together is harder. And atomized societies do not do well in crisis.
And there's a question, I will just answer this question because why am I not in my home studio today? Well, it's because I tried to check the data connection, the upload download speed, and it was really bad on the upload. So I thought I might not be able to broadcast properly. And so I went to the nearest township hall that I knew had open Wi-Fi. And so I'm sitting in my car at the township hall. So yeah, I tried sitting outside, but I didn't have a little table to put the computer on. But anyway, thank you everybody for viewing. And if at all possible, we'll be back next week. And if not, so I mean, you'll see us pop up eventually.
Yep.
Take care, Nicole. Drink a lot of water. I hope you feel better.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.